Brilliant. Just while you collect your thoughts, if I could start, guys. You all started work in the 1960s.
1962,
I want to ask, can you tell us a bit more about how disability was dealt with in both the workplace and the community back in the 1960s and 70s when you were younger guys? So how was disability dealt with both at the face in the pit, but also in the community in the 60s and 1970s?
Well, I'm going back in 1960s and 70s. It was always the union that taken on the cases on board. And at that time, there was a lot of accidents. There was quite a number of accidents. And now and again, you had pneumoconiosis would crop up. And Nicky was right. It used to be if you went to the doctor and he says, oh, you've got chronic bronchitis and emphysema, and that sort of, the view was that blew your chance to ever claiming for pneumo. But because of I lived in a coalboard house next to the pit. My dad worked in the pit, my Uncle Pete, my Uncle Joe, they all worked in the pit. So anything that was dealt with by the union at the pit. I could mind even when I was a laddie, I broke my wrist playing football, and they didn't take you to the doctor. I went up to the pit, they took me to the pit to see the pit nurse. He sent me to the hospital. I mean, because it was near her hand, and that's the way it worked.
I think it's important. I mean, I did touch on it earlier about how they tried to accommodate in the industry at that time. National Coal Board had a conscience, I think. It was a massive industry. You know, they had a medical division and all that, and there was an accommodation. I mean, there was men worked down the pit with one arm that could shovel with a stump, and you know, the arm, and we even had a guy in the pit bottom that had one leg and things like that. Nobody, if it was possible, you know, with whatever happened to them, injury or anything, was put out if it was possible to keep them there. But that changed dramatically, I think, in my view anyway, as, you know, 70s, 80s came in. They didn't accommodate that side. It became, manpower levels dropped so much that, you know, I'm not saying you were carrying passengers by any means, they all done a job, but that part of the industry went completely, I think, in my view anyway. Davey, if you remember?
Oh, it's a long time ago. When I was in the pit, like you had a group, the base workers, and they were sent somewhere, and the boys that weren't so fit, weren't so strong, they were always given a sort of easier job. That's the way we looked at it, If there was a lot of lifting, a lot of shoveling, being girders up and that, there were certain men done that. And there were certain men done the fetching and carrying sort of thing. But yeah, we sort of looked after each other,
Thanks, guys. Questions or comments? Maybe Ken first and then Tennessee Miles.
My name is Ken Donaldson. I worked in the Institute of Occupational Medicine, which was the Coal Board's medical research institute for 20 years, working on coal workers' lung disease and other kinds of dust-related lung disease. Now I'm with the University of Edinburgh. I'm retired. I was the professor of respiratory toxicology. I spent my entire working life researching into dust-related lung disease. And what Nicky said, I think he said that the Coal Board had a conscience. I think that puts it lightly. I mean, the Coal Board employed hundreds, thousands of people to carry out something called the pneumoconiosis field research, which was the basis of the dust standard in the collieries. So it's never been done since, and it was never done before, just because it's such a huge undertaking. They went round the collieries in the UK. They took regular X-rays, regular lung function tests. They measured the dust level in the pits. And when the lungs, when the miners died, their lungs came up to Edinburgh. I was part of the pathology team who worked on these lungs to quantify the amount of lung disease. So if you take all that together, you can do a kind of really fancy, difficult analysis, but to find out what is the level of dust at which, the lowest level of dust at which you see virtually no lung disease. And that was the aim of that study. and it took best part of 20 to 25 years, but finally delivered a level of 4 milligrams per metre cubed respirable dust in a return roadway. And that became the dust standard for the entire world. And as Nicky said, it almost abolished pneumoconiosis, apart from maybe category 1, the early categories of pneumoconiosis in the UK, and worldwide, in fact. Now, that's not to say that all the pits were able to do that, and there were big mistakes. Lady Vic's a good example, where silicosis came up and they had a rash of silicosis. Because there's a difference between silicosis and co-workers pneumoconiosis. They're different diseases. They look somewhat similar, but they're different. So I just wanted to just say that. I mean, the coal board were not. I mean, the history of occupational diseases makes unedifying reading. It's always a case of where the companies aren't willing to admit to the fact that the workforce is being injured. I mean, everybody here knows that. The coal board was no different to a degree, but I think certainly after nationalisation, I think things greatly improved, and I think that pneumoconiosis field research was a world first, and in fact it's never been done since. And all the American standards, the Japanese standards, everywhere is based on pneumoconiosis field research. The second thing was just to quickly say about COPD. It's not as easy as it might sound. The main thing that causes COPD, and it's the most potent cause of COPD, is cigarette smoking. COPD is still pandemic in the UK. It's not in coal workers. It's pandemic in the general population. It's the bronchitis and that emphysema that you get from smoking cigarettes. Also, there are dusty trades that cause it. So coal mining definitely causes it, but it's not easy, and it certainly wasn't easy back then to tell the difference between COPD caused by smoking, and many miners smoked. Almost all miners smoked. Though there was a proportion who didn't smoke, and they did get COPD. It's just worth saying that. But it's difficult to untangle COPD. It's impossible, actually, to untangle COPD from smoking, from that caused by working in a dusty environment. You can't tell the difference. It's a black box. Somebody breathes smoke, somebody breathes coal dust, you get a disease. You can't really tell which is which. So it is difficult. I mean, I'm a friend of the miner. I think the miners should be compensated. I believe it's and it's certainly they did that a decade ago, and a lot of people didn't get before that. They should have got compensation, I think, but it's a difficult thing to do.
Just respond to any of those?
Just on the smoking thing, you're right to raise the smoking thing, because when it was a claim for the civil side of it, Nicky, smoking was certainly taken into account, and any compensation was drastically cut among smokers. But with the DSSS, the criteria they've set is 20 years underground in a coal mine, on the balance of probability, that qualifies you. But if you've got 20 years, and if you've been a smoker, and you've got a litre drop in lung function, then you qualify for the pension. But if you've got 19 years, and you've got COPD, and you've never smoked in your life, you didn't qualify. So certainly, it's a part of it. And a lot of the consultants that sit in the tribunals, no so many now, but a lot of them took the view that smoking certainly should have been an aspect when they were doing the disability. And because I've heard people that didn't have the 20 years saying, I've got COPD, I've never smoked in my life, and I'm on 3 inhalers, and so, because he's got 20 years, he's smoked all his days. So it's not a fair playing field. It's certainly not a fair playing field. But the pneumo side, you're right about the pneumo under the coal board. I can't mind when they'd done it, but probably before my time. But the regular x-rays and the new pits like say Muckton Halls and Benabert, the ventilation was, I can't mind anybody originally getting diagnosed with pneumo. But they also set up, whether it was stage 1 or stage 2, when you got an x-ray, if you had stage 1, the first thing the coal board had done was to put you in a dust-free atmosphere. And that changed, because I worked in the private industry. And when I was working at Muckton Hall in the private industry, they eventually got an x-ray unit in through pressure for us. And one of the boys that worked at the Tammy Mills, David, you can't tell Tammy Mills, he worked at the return shaft. And the manager got me in the office, he says, Alec, he says, one of the men's got pneumoconiosis, Tammy Mills. I said, well, we better get him out of there. So to be fair, they moved on at the surface, and they didn't cut his wages. And I says, Tommy, you've been diagnosed with pneumoconiosis. He says, I've had it for 20 years. He says, I got diagnosed in the Lady Victoria years ago. So he knew he had it, but he hadn't tell them. And that was them just discovering that he had Newmacon, you'll say, he was working in probably one of the most dustiest bits in the party, but he's still living and still with us.
Can I just say, I mean, Ken's right. I remember reading IOM stuff, and that was very, very important research. And I think you're correct, you know, that made big changes in our industry. And I remember that Lady Victoria stuck out like a sore thumb back in the 70s and that, for whatever reason. I don't know if it was the coal seams they worked in or whatever. Yeah. But, yeah, there was rogue. Yeah. And that was the difference I was going to say, that in my understanding that silicosis is where we would say it was men that were driving the tunnels into the rock rather than the silica, you know, rather than the coal dust to the coal face workers. I mean, that's, in layman's terms, how we always understood it, you know. Yeah. And you need much lower levels of silica, don't you? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, hello, my name's Miles Oglethorpe. I'm a trustee of the National Mining Museum Scotland's collections, and I also work for Historic Scotland. And I'm interested, from a public perception point of view, in the focus that there always tends to be in relation to accidents on fatalities, rather than accidents more generally. And I'm interested to know from the panel the extent to which, rather like, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan, where you hear about people who died, but you don't hear about the people that were injured. I'm wondering what the iceberg's like, to what extent the casualties from accidents were non-fatal, and what the impact of that has been on disability in the mining communities.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right, Miles, in the sense that, you know, I suppose it'd be a very interesting bit of research to find out how many actual miners, percentage-wise, have a disability of some sort for an accident. Because I quite honestly believe it would be 50-60%, just as a guess, you know, genuinely. And that is a hidden factor. I mean, some obviously are less serious than others, but, you know, the unfortunate thing in our history in mining's littered with it, that it catches the headlines when there's a fatality or a disaster. And unfortunately, that's, if you look back, that's when legislation changes because of something that happens, loss of life. Oh, we'll need to look at that, research it, bring forward something that may prevent that in the future. But injuries, you're right, there's thousands and thousands of men carry injuries, be it scarring, be it loss of fingers, you know, eye, anything like that. And I would say it's a pretty high percentage, actually, because of the nature of it, you know, the industry. When you go down the hole in the ground, it's like every day can be a different day. It's not like going into a factory environment where you've got a row of machines, whatever, and you know they're there. Ground moves, water can come in, rock falls, anything. And that's where the miner is such a skilled person, in my view, that they have to go down, they had to go down on a day-to-day basis not knowing what they were facing. And the reason their skills were there is they had to, nobody was there to tell them what to do. They had to take on board how they make that safe, how they done the job and all the rest of it. And that led to, as I say, many, many injuries. I think, I wouldn't guess, but I would say it'd be well over 50% of men's probably carry an injury of some kind. You know? Even me.
So the other kind of interesting is mental day. And where I worked, we went in a new section, and when you were cutting the coal, obviously it fell. You're waiting for the roof coming down at the back of you. Well, the section we were working, the roof wasn't coming down. So this went on and went on, and the officials tell us, could hear the things like thunder, ready to come. Never came. So it must have been easy, the length of a football pitch, and it hadn't given its break yet. And everybody was worried, but they wanted to keep going. So eventually, luckily, I was on the back shift, and it gave us break on the day shift. And well, we had all the props, all the, what do you call them?
Policeman.
For pushing in the
Rams, chocks.
The chokes, we had all the chokes. Were all there, they were all up to a 4 foot seam. So when the place gave its break over, I wasn't there, but everybody had to dive out, right? So these chokes could had an incredible weight, but when it gave its break, the chokes were flat right down to the ground. Unbelievable. We walked in and seen it. It was incredible. These strong came, the chokes weighed tons, and they were just, thing went right down to the bottom. And the boy at was day shift, he said to me, see what happened? He got up a bit, put his stuff out his locker, went home, never came back. He told me, he said, I'll never be back after that. Yeah, and it just played on his mind all the time.
Just to follow on with Nicky, I think, I mean, if you're talking about an accident, it could be, there's a lot of men lost fingers or bones broken, but no, again, long-term accidents. So aye, they will be high, but I would say it's certainly under nationalisation. If you go back, I mean, the worst disaster in Scotland was at Blantyre. I just can't mind the number off the top of my head, but Blantyre was the worst disaster. Just about aye. And then under nationalisation, the Auchingeich was probably about the worst one, and then you had the Michael. And then the last year I can mind was Seafield, where there was 5 men killed. So McGackie used to say you've got to die in a crowd for it to be a disaster, because you had to have 5 people killed. But when anybody was killed, it was a disaster for their family. But you're right, to a certain extent, you always can't, I can mind, well, when I live in Danderaw, we put a monument up to the 10 men that was killed in Mupton Hall during its working life. You could say it's not a lot, and it isn't a lot, but it's 10 men that lost their lives in that period. But if you go back to years ago, some of the disasters were horrific. And Davey was on about the mental strain. Nicky worked in Cardown, and you mind when the fire, when the spark, the face line, the ball of fire up the face line, nobody killed. But I was dealing with a case for a boy. He was at Cope Brig at the Mines Rescue. He come from the east of Scotland, and he was doing his face training in Cardown, and he was in the face that day, because Cardown was near to Cope Brig, and he never went back. He finished, just cleaved his locker, never went back. Biggest fight in his life. So aye, there is a mental side to it and all.
I think that's an important point, because as a union we put in a resolution into Scottish Trade Union Congress, I think it's 5 years ago now, about post-traumatic stress. And I know we hear a lot of it, about the armed forces and that, and the unfortunate late woman that's been raped and things like that. But when we started, I was involved with an organisation that were looking at that, and when you start thinking about it, the 40 men that got burned in the Cardown explosion, not one of them ever went back down underground. Now, they were burned black, superficial burns, thankfully no deep. And there was only one guy, he got sort of blown out the road and suffered, head injuries and all the rest of it. But the fact is that those men, some of them became alcoholics, one committed suicide, and post-traumatic stress, and not only in the mining industry, but in generality, it's like a car accident, like firemen going into buildings. If you witness somebody being killed or being involved in an accident like that, you can understand what Davey says about that guy, seeing that, that it's a terrifying moment. And, it was bad enough going down a pit to earn your living and that, but to think and worry about, what if that happens again? And I think that's a hidden nature and disability that has never been taken on. I mean, our resolution get carried, but nothing's ever happened about it, to be honest. And I'm talking about in the whole trade union movement, because it doesn't just affect miners, it can affect, office workers, shop workers if they're attacked, anything like that. And post-traumatic stress, while it's getting a big thing about armed forces now, it's there in the generality of life, and certainly in workplaces. And I think it's something we're missing out on. It's, it's something that needs to be taken on more and more.
There is a commissioner's decision. It wasn't in mining, but it was the fire brigade. Where I remember the fire brigade attended a road traffic accident, and 3 people were killed, and they had to cut out the bodies and that. And they put a claim in saying it was an industrial accident. They says, well, it wasn't. because he wasn't injured, but he was mentally injured. And I believe the Commissioner took the view that it was an accident at work. He was carrying out his normal duties at work, and that was left a post-traumatic stress. I didn't care what happened to the boy later, but I know there was a Commissioner. I've not seen it for years, but it was kicking about for a long time. And that's the fire brigade, they go to things like that. I suppose the police are the same.
Vicky's next.
Thank you. I'm Vicky Long and I'm a lecturer in health history at Glasgow Cali, but I'm also a collaborator with Arthur and Angie on the Coalfield Disability Project. I'm just working in the North East with my colleague Victoria. And one of the things we're looking at the moment actually really touches nicely on the discussion you're having at the moment, which is about the psychological impact of traumatic accidents and injuries in men. So I'm really interested in this discussion, and I wonder if we could push it a little bit further. When you started talking, Nicky, you talked about how the union did its best to support men with mental health issues. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about in your working experience, and this might be something that other people on the panel would like to comment on, about how efforts were made to support men who experience psychological issues, perhaps as a consequence of traumatic injuries or developing an industrial disease. Was there an attempt maybe to focus on the physical health problems as a means to secure compensation for people who are affected in this way? And has there been a kind of process of change over time in the same way, for example, that you saw that upsurge in pneumoconiosis as a consequence of the miners' strike? I'm wondering whether changing in mining practices had much of a psychological impact. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the honest truth is no. It was the physical aspect that we have, as a union, concentrated on. And as I said, because of our involvement with another few bodies in this a few years ago, we put that in because, and I'm sorry to say, but I think it's kind of been left behind again because, and it should be an issue it's taken on. And I mean, I'll give you the example. I worked at Cardown at the time when the explosion happened in 1980. And thankfully, I mean, I was part of the investigation team into it after it. And it was like, you know, a 600-700 feet long tunnel with pure ash. And in that were 40 men. That the flame went up and down and burned them, scorched them. And they all get carried out and taken out. And as I say, not one of them went back. But if the honest truth was told back then, we probably, and we did get them compensation because they had to leave the industry and that. But taking into account the mental effect of that was probably very, very little, if any. I've got to say that. It was before my time involved a full-time official. I would genuinely like to think now that we do, obviously we've no deep mines left in Scotland now, we've got surface mines and there has been a couple of fatalities there, and part of the thing we do now is insist that there is psychological help given to people, you know, to try and get them back. Not only them, their families as well, which is important. And I think there is a growing feeling that should be taken on more and more, but I don't think it's big enough yet. And I think it's a major player in things. As we understand it more and more, people know better than me about it. But I just feel that is a hidden thing that years ago was never covered. You know, that, you know, we had a fatality in Kernley 3 years ago, where two guys were sitting as close as Myrette and me are standing in a rock fall, and one get killed, another one get scratched. Now, you know, that guy that happened to was off his work for 9 months because the guy he worked alongside get killed and he was left. And there's a guilt feeling that comes out of things like that, you know. And I totally agree with you, but I think, and it's something the trade union movement, I think, has to address more and more. And I would like to think as a union, we're not a big industry now, and we've not got a lot now, but I think if we had a bigger industry, it would play a much more important part now. We would certainly be pushing for that anyway. No?
I think that's right. It wasn't really taken into account with the stress. I can mind an incident in Muckton Hall just after the strike. Big Jerry McKeag was the leading miner, and they were doing a drivage with a Dosco didn't header, and he was on holiday that day, he wasn't working, and the young boy that took out the machine put his head on top of the machine. Of course, he was killed. And Big Norrie McCabe always blamed himself for that laddie being killed. He says if he was only 24-year-old. Norrie says, if I had been out that day, that would never have happened. I said, Norrie, you can't keep thinking like that. So he wasn't there, but it had an effect on him, and that's, I think it's something that we've never, Nicky's right, was never really been addressed at that, like it should have been.
I think years ago, sort of mental health issues in particular weren't recognised, and because minors were people who didn't talk about their problems, it didn't come to the fore. Do you know the thing?
Well, men are
And men,
like that.
and men in particular don't like going to GPs. I mean, there's research on that, isn't there? But particularly minors just didn't go to the doctor. They didn't talk about these kind of things. So it was possibly not recognised years ago. I think now it's a bit easier to, because as a social work service, we would kind of address the whole package of mental health and physical health. But unless somebody's actually telling you or giving you an indication, then it's difficult to bring that on.
Yeah. And I think I go back to some of the things I said originally, that if you were the breadwinner, sometimes you didn't want to know things, because if you were told, well, you're not going to be able to work anymore and that, I'm not saying that was in every case, but that was a factor of men's thinking at times, that they didn't want to lose their opportunity of being able to provide for their families and that.
At times, Dave, we had an incident in a lady on a night shift. The night shift had a job to do, and kind of had to be done sort of thing. So there were 3 men and an official, and they had to get this girder up. But girder's heavy and that, and the easiest way to get in was bring it in the chain, which is illegal. But there was an official there, so I don't think it was illegal. But the 3 of them struggled to get a girder on the chain. There was a boy in the bottom for the chain. He started the chain away. I reckon if he'd done it by mistake or whatever, anyway, thing went away, the girder got stuck, bounced back, and hit the official right in the head. Killed him outright. So these 3 boys, this is a true story by the way, my bank it's not.
I mind it, David.
These 3 boys thought, right, what can we do? Which they should have gone touch with a bit of head right away. But they seen the boy, it's dead. So they decided to help his wife out, because the position he was in, getting help with a girder, which had been on a chain, which was illegal, right? So the boys decided to carry the official 50 yards out the road, got a big stone and lay it next to him, right? So I was thinking the stone fell for the roof. Well, the stone had fell for the roof, but not at that time. So they went back, phoned up ahead, police, everything done. And eventually, of course, they got to the truth, and these 3 boys were all charged. None of them ever worked in the pit again.
Nice.
But they were thinking, this boy will get none, but if he got hit with a stone, his wife will get thousands of pounds. They were thinking about the wife and family. But obviously it wasn't the right thing to do.
What
No,
date
just-
was that, David?
Yeah?
What date was that? What time was that roughly?
That was the 80s,
It was the night shift, it was
1980s, wasn't it?
it was before the strike, I think.
It
Well, it was unbelievable.
It was an illegal practice, and the silly thing about it is that a lot of the injuries in the pit are sometimes caused by illegal practice, but illegal practice takes place because the employer is not supplied proper equipment, all the rest of it, and there are ways round it. But Davey's right, these guys thought they were doing the right thing in their way, of saying, well, that guy, because he was a safety supervisor, if you like, it was even worse for him to take part in that illegal practice. But but it doesn't work that way, unfortunately, and that's just a sad fact of a case like that. For men thinking they were doing the right thing, but they were doing completely wrong thing for everybody.
It was just the spirit of the moment,
Yeah.
Again, everybody was upset. They wouldn't be thinking right.
Pamela, I think you were next.
Sorry. Fascinating discussion. My name's Pamela McIntyre and I'm the volunteer coordinator for Pits, Ponies, People and Stories. And I think you've got a flyer. This is my colleague Jenny Hunter. So we've been taking ex-miners into schools, and one of the ways that we've been trying to communicate to primary 7 pupils about the health and safety issues in mining was, well, me personally, I started talking to them about the oil industry and the fact that they had grounded a lot of the helicopters, and they were looking to redevelop internally and externally the helicopters, and the kids could immediately understand that that was an industry dealing with perceived and real challenges to health and safety. So we were able to talk to them about the health and safety issues in mining, and the fact that that hadn't really been tackled over many years, and that a lot of men were continued to work in dangerous conditions. So it was just to kind of put that in the room, that there are still kind of current referenced instances of health and safety and how it's dealt with. And also about the Chilean miners, very few of whom have been able to go back to work. One is because they are seen as a point of reference to the press. If future accidents happen to them, that would be very, very difficult for the mining industry to cope with. They're also seen as attracting the wrong kind of publicity for them and their work colleagues, so that the kind of complicated effects of dealing with the safety issues. But for us, obviously we're going to hopefully meet a lot of ex-miners and their families, and I'm suddenly struck that we possibly might come across people who are starting to realise that they're becoming unwell because of their time in the industry. So for us, first of all, it might be useful for us to get our hands on definitions of mining industrial diseases and where could we get that, but also who is the best place for us to direct people who are experiencing failing health. Who do we direct them to?
Well, it's either ourselves or kids with social workers, but we work together anyway.
Right.
I mean, if I get people come to me, if it's depending what it is, if I need a home visit, then we go to Myrette, they do that, they start the basics. People at ALEC, if it comes to an appeal where they have to be represented at a tribunal, ALEC does that. So it doesn't matter who it is, but we work in conjunction. But one of the biggest problems is that we were a massive industry not that many years ago. I mean, in the 80s, you had 250,000 people employed in the mining industry in Britain. You've now got roughly 2,000 underground miners left in the whole of Britain, out with surface mining. And the focal point of all these things that we talk about was always the union at the colliery. And as you know, mining communities, the only reason you've got communities is because you had a pit there in some of the cases. They went together, and that's the uniqueness of it. And when the industry closed down so quickly and so dramatically, that communication was lost, and that is a big, big difficulty. I mean, we started forming retired miners branches in the 1990s, 1990 actually, because we realised we'd lost the communication with the people that would turn up at the pit. Even if they'd retired, they knew there was a rep there, a union rep there that they could speak to and all that. But that all went, and that was a big, big help to us in Scotland, I must say. And other areas have followed that now, because it's more community-based rather than colliery-based, but it still gives you a link back. And I mean, Myrette touched on it about once the collieries went, then that communication about even general knowledge, things about, sickness, claiming benefits, they've nobody to go to. And if you come across anybody, by all means, either between CISWO or ourselves, that's what we're there for, to help them. And most of our work now, to be perfectly blunt, is historical work, dealing with people who suffer for this, rather than having a big industry where we represent things now. That's just the facts of life of what we do now.
We've also found that a lot of the miners, just hooked, like you were talking about, not going to medics, not going to, they're very proud and, quite rightly so. They were extremely technical, knowledge-based industry. They were working remotely underground. They had to make decisions based on their skills and experience. So they've got a certain amount of, a complete right to be proud. But they are it's difficult then to get them to talk and share, you know, their experiences. And I've just been to a conference there, we were talking about Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, and about the Aboriginal peoples who've been completely kind of subjugated there. And their answer was to get community groups together. They were crying their tears and catching their tears on tissues and putting their tissues in a paper bag, and then they're burning the bags on a ceremonial fire. So that's what I'm going to use now. That if the miners don't want to talk to me, I'm going to say, right, well, your options are you talk to us, or you cry your tears. You're going to catch your tears and you're going to put them in a bag. So I'm hoping that, you know, there is a kind of growing awareness that they have a story to tell and they have experiences to share. You know, behind every sad story, you know, David was saying that they were trying to help, you know, a family to get round what was going to be a tragic accident. So there's a lot of humanity there as well. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get them to talk about their experiences, or they'll be crying on the tissues.
Yeah. If you can get a coal fire nowadays.
You get quite a number of elderly people, and Myrette's organisation, CISWO, especially during the summer, we've got the two miners' homes, one at Gullen and one at Curis. And Myrette will carry the figures, but there's quite a number of older people there with disabilities, and they've never claimed attendance allowance. And they didn't think they'd be entitled to it because they've got a miner's pension and they've got their old age pension. But I don't know, Myrette, you probably can off the top of your head.
I don't know the exact figures, but it is quite high. But I think that's kind of prevalent throughout, not just within the coal industry. It's, you know, benefits in particular. There isn't a massive take-up in those kind of benefits because they're not advertised.
No. So where we've got the community groups, like where I live in Dandar, I'm the chairman of the retired miners branch. Anybody, you've done a lot of visits to people in the community, and not just miners, other groups in the community. So it's having somewhere to go to get the advice, and it's not always the correct advice you've got. But I would say they should always go through CISWO, because the Coal Industry Social Welfare Organisation is also you can help with certain things if they're needing some funding for a new cooker.
Yeah, we do hardship grants.
They do hardship grants and all that. And if somebody dies with pneumoconiosis, then there's a benefit for contacting CISWO. But I don't know how many ex-miners that's got pneumoconiosis pass away and their families are not keen to contact Myrette. If it happened beside me, I would tell them to contact Myrette, as is their assistance for the funeral. And that money's there, but it's getting the message across. Nicky's right. One time we used to have the Scottish Miner with marine paper and things like that, but they're not there now. They're not there.
Yeah. One of the other things, just on that, briefly, is that one of the problems we've always had with pneumoconiosis and that is that when a person's living, it's an opinion of a radiographer or whatever, somebody that's looking at x-rays and all that. And the unfortunate thing is, and Ken will know that, is it's only through autopsy you really prove if it's in fact there or not, isn't it, in lung tissues and that. And that's always been a difficulty. Sometimes families, and it's not just in mining, but if their loved one passes away, they don't want them then to be looked at in that sense, you know. And that's been a big difficulty at times as well, you know. And I don't know if we'll ever change that, you know, in relation to it.
I think if people have suffered, if they've been on oxygen 24 hours a day for several years, or a shorter time usually, then the family don't really want to do that. And in a lot of cases, it's not about the money anyway.
No, it's...
You know, it's not that, the money isn't going to change anything, but it is still an entitlement, so it's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. Sometimes it's a man himself determined to prove it enough.
Yeah.
You know, just because he's fought for years maybe to get it and has been
and
refused.
he's stipulated that on
And
his
they
death
tell
he
their
wants a
family to do
postmortem.
it.
Yeah.
Ian's next. Other questions, guys? Just going to get a queue, Sue, and then Ian.
My name is Ian Hutchison. I'm a social historian of disability at the University of Glasgow. I just want to mention before I ask a question, I've been interviewing quite a lot of surgeons and physicians and so forth recently, and of the male surgeons and physicians, which represent by far the majority, there's a fair number that have mentioned to me when they don't feel well, they don't like to go and see the doctor. So it's not just minors.
No, it's a man thing.
Anyway, I'd like to ask a question. It's maybe a slightly personal, direct question to David. Firstly, I'm wondering, does David feel that he is disabled? Disability is a very kind of broad concept, as I think has already come out. And if he categorises himself as being disabled, at what stage in his decline in health did he actually see himself going from ill health into disability? And if I could maybe sort of put the same question in more general terms to Myrette, in terms of the people that she encounters, what's the borderline, if you like, between ill health and disability that she encounters? Do people have to be persuaded, hey, you've got a disability, you should look at this in a different way? Or is there a counter-argument that don't look on yourself as being disabled? Yes, there are issues, but look on the positive side, that kind of perspective. So I'm just trying to get at really how disability is perceived in the wider scale of ill health, through diseases through mining, or indeed through various types of injuries.
Well, it hit me quite quick. As I say, I was walking up hills, losing breath, couldn't get up ladders. It just seemed to hit me all at once. And I didn't know why it stopped working. As I explained, I couldn't go up the ladders, I was doing the bottom windows, but it was getting worse. And it was getting worse quite quick. And then, again, you never mentioned it in the house, but then the wife would see me try to go up the stairs to the toilet, and I was having to huddle to the banister and just go one step at a time. And she said, look at you, like an old man got up here, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, eventually I had to tell her, She said, we'll get to the doctor. So that's when it was started. But mine seemed to harm, again, I seem to hit about 50 and then go right to the hill. Again, so, but then again, when I look about, and I'm sitting, I didn't feel disabled or not. Again, I still feel like I should be going for a pint. Again,
Playing football.
having a laugh, playing football, do that. But can I do that, As soon as I got up, again, walk 20 years or whatever, I was struggling. Again. And where I stay, there's no many pubs or that. And I'd have to go, again, a good bit to get down to meet boys that I used to drink with every day of the week. Well, not as much as that, but 3 or 4 times. Again, doing for a couple of pints that. I've never seen any boys for years. Some of them come up and visit me and that, but again, sometimes you don't want visitors, do you? And you really just sit about and reminisce and what have you. So, it hit me quite quick, and again, I still dream of being able to run. Again, I have funny dreams and that. And you wake up in the morning and say, is there anything wrong with me? And when you get up, you just can't get out of bed. Yeah, and you can't stand up. So it's funny, like, it's funny but no funny, you get what I mean? But as I say, it hit me quite quick. And it took me a long time to persuade folk or persuade, again, people that had silicosis. Again, it wasn't just, again, bronchitis or whatever. And that's what's a wee bit disappointing, again.
It should be fairly readily diagnosable by X-ray, that's the stage.
It isn't, that's right. I had a few X-rays now. But I kept trying to shove the point over. Again, I'd swallowed dust for 20 years, again. That must have had something to do with it. And eventually, when they said, you have got silicosis.
Anything but breathing in silica, I mean.
That's right.
And when they found out, I didn't feel good about it. But I sort of felt like I'd proved it, yeah. But as I say, it had me quite quick. And that's about 10 years now, again. I've lost quite a lot in 10 years, because I was quite active, and I've done a lot of things I shouldn't have done, but can't do them at all. Can't do nothing there, personally. Can't lift the grandparents up. Yeah. Can't take the grandparents a walk. Then I've got 10 grandbairns, and it's hard work and expensive, but it's worth it. But yeah, again, before you could lift them up, look after them, tell the daughter to have a break, yeah. Can't do that now. If they bairns fall, again, or get injured, I can hardly pick them up. So it has affected me quite a lot, like. But you just got to get on with it. So that's it.
Yeah, I think that's the side of it that people don't really see, though, isn't it? They see the difficulty with breathing, but they don't see the way it affects, you know, your social life, your family life, how you can interact with your family. It's an interesting question, Ian, and I don't think in all the visits that I've done over 10 years, anybody has ever said to me that they're disabled. I don't think anybody's ever said that. No, they haven't. Even I don't think they've even said I've got an illness. They say what the condition is, and they say how it affects their everyday life. But people have never ever said, you know, can you come and visit me because I'm disabled? Never. That's interesting, isn't it?
I mean, do they maybe react in different ways?
Moved on.
Sorry, I'm just...
I think when it's a disability that you don't see as well, you know, like a breathing problem, that people might not class it as that. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, what David's described is a lot of different experiences under different circumstances, and I'm wondering if people maybe react in different ways depending what's at stake. If they're being suggested they have a disability that might be a disadvantage, they'll maybe reject the notion.
Yeah.
And, but if you then say, well, do you realise that you could get a blue badge, you could park your car right in front of the supermarket. Well, in that case, I have got a wee bit of a disability. Do you find it varies that way? Because I quite often find that's the case.
I do things like blue badge applications on a daily basis, and it's still never, the people have still never said, I've got a disability. They've not said those specific words. They might have said, I've got arthritis, I've got a breathing problem, my mobility is very poor, I can't walk to the shops, but they wouldn't ever say, I have a disability. It's not a word that anybody's ever used. I can't ever think that anybody's used that word.
I go for the blue badge, and at first I wasn't going to take it, because I didn't want to park in a disabled car. And I didn't feel I was as bad as, and I seen folk in it with their wheelchairs, and eventually I took it, like. But at first, I said, I'm not taking it, I'm too young to have a blue badge.
I'll tell you, our experience, certainly my experience, and probably Myrette and Alex, the same, that when the COPD compensation scheme came out, VWF as well, it's amazing the amount of minors you've actually got to force to put in a claim. I'm saying force, that's the wrong word, but encourage. Because a lot of them think, well, it's like a charity thing and all that, you know. I mean, people talk about as if they're all greedy minors and want compensation for this, that. That is not our experience. And to this day, I know certain individuals that have never submitted a claim, despite suffering probably for the disease, but they don't want to do it because they just feel, well, that was my job, I done it and all that, and these are the repercussions, but I'm going to accept it. And I find that, you know, I've had to sit with umpteen people, and probably usually the same, and explain, but wait a minute, you worked 30, 40 years underground, you got that because of your nature of your work and all the rest of it. It wasn't your fault, so, you know, do it. And genuinely, I mean, people, they don't just come forward about it. You've got to actively encourage them to do it. And if it wasn't for the surgeries that we've had in my places like miners' homes over the years, and this will be throughout Britain, I would say you probably would have reached half the claims. That's my genuine belief in that you have to encourage people to do it, rather than they're going to turn up at your door demanding you to help them fill in for. It's the exact opposite in my experience.
Susan's next.
Hi, it's Sue Morrison. He always calls me Susan. It reminds me of getting told off when I was a kid. I'm a social and oral historian here at Strathclyde. I'm also the daughter of a miner who was disabled. And he had MS, so it wasn't an industrial disease or accident. But I do remember the union. It was around about my 7th birthday, which is just before Christmas. And the union turned up at the door, trade union members, I should say. And my mother had been in hospital for a couple of months at that point. She was very unwell. My dad was still working, but he was backwards and forwards to his shifts, and we were palmed out to different relatives to look after us. But I always remember these trade union guys turning up with a big bag of toys for us and this Christmas tree. But it had loads of tinsel on it and baubles, and it even had lights on it. And they parked it in the front room. And otherwise, we wouldn't have had a Christmas that year. And you can tell, it's, it meant a lot. So thank you. That aside, and I'm getting silly, what I was wondering was how much support is there for families these days? I mean, that was the trade union members in the local area who did it off their own back. They had a collection that came round. But I wondered how much support there is for families. And my other point is, as an academic, if I can't get over this silliness and my voice croaking, is one of the reasons why silicosis isn't diagnosed often these days is that no one recognises what it is. The medical schools haven't been training doctors, general practitioners in particular, about silicosis, pneumoconiosis, any of these industrial diseases since the 1990s. I asked, when I studied silicosis, I asked 6 of my own GPs, we have quite a large practice, every time I went to the doctors, I spoke to a different one, and I asked them what they could tell me about silicosis. 2 of the older ones, who were both due to be retired, said that they remembered silicosis as an old miner's disease. The other 4 had never heard of it. They didn't know what silicosis was. It's hardly surprising then that when people's first point of contact when they start feeling poorly is their GP. Now, if GPs don't understand what silicosis is or pneumoconiosis or any of these other industrial diseases, how then can they direct them to the proper consultant who can do the proper diagnostic tests? And this is, for me, with my research, and it was extensive 3-year research, it showed that, people are just being underdiagnosed. This coverall of COPD covers lots of different ailments. Lots of people who don't smoke are covered in by COPD, and there are no further investigations done. They're just given this label and then that's it. I think that people who are labelled as COPD are perhaps suffering from chalk dust. Lots of teachers, not so much these days, but certainly people who taught in the 70s and 80s. There are farmers' lungs. You mentioned farmers before. Lots of them have respiratory diseases, and it is caused by their job in some cases, but that is not recognised, as well as lots of industrial workers. And silicosis, the cases that I studied, involves lots of industries, not just coal mining, but construction workers, demolition workers, lots of extraction workers, road builders, all these kind of things. It is quite widespread, but it is underdiagnosed. So I wondered, can you guys, as trade union members, the NUM, do anything to kind of influence the way that medical training is pursued in hospitals these days? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it's a new problem, to be honest, for us, because I think we've tried to touch on it. The evidence is there to do it, and through people at the IOM and things like that. But the difficulty's been that, in our experience over the years, even when we had a large industry, it was difficult to get a GP or anything to say it was that, because you need X-ray evidence and other things, as we know. And that didn't always happen. When they started the screening in the National Coal Board, when the X-ray vans, they had to come to the pit at least every year, I think it was, and there was a screening programme, and that picked up things. But diagnosis has always been about. I made the point earlier that until you get into pathology, autopsies, then it is an opinion, isn't it? And you know, sometimes it's a radiographer that looks at the X-ray, sometimes it's a consultant, but it varies. And I'm not expert enough to know, you know, the difference, but you can get. We've had appeals where somebody that should be an expert has said, no, there's nothing there, it's something else, fibrosis, this or that. And then somebody else will look at it and say, no, that's clearly silicosis, pneumoconiosis. And that's always been a difficulty. And I don't think that, you know, to be honest, I wouldn't expect GPs, they might pick up the signs, but I think their role should be, like many other things, is to pass it on to the experts, or the so-called expert. I mean, we touched on earlier, Alec mentioned it, the 1979 Act, pneumoconiosis, but it's not just pneumoconiosis, it's bicyanosis and all that, you know, that mill workers and things get off that. So there's lots of diseases that touch each other. I mean, we've came across a couple in the last number of years, 5 years ago, interstitial fibrosis for guys that work down the pit. In fact, I worked with one of them at Cardown, younger than me, and he died of it. And try to, you know, get proof that was caused. It's apparently not caused by that, but it's so similar to what pneumoconiosis is and all that. And as I say, I'm not going to come along here and profess to be an expert, but you can understand families like that who have seen people, that's pneumoconiosis he's got, same symptoms, same everything, but it turns out it isn't, and we couldn't get proof. You know, that's 2 cases recently that I've came across. Both worked at Cardown Colliery, incidentally. I don't suppose that's anything to do with it, but I don't think diagnosis is a new problem. I think it's always been there. And I think at times maybe people older than me would think back, and when they did go to their GP, was there the same expertise back then in the 50s, even the 60s? I doubt it to a certain extent, but I don't think there's an excuse now. I think the evidence is there, but GPs should be passing it on to people who probably could do it better. And best sense of the word, I'm not saying, because they're experts in their field, aren't they? And that's where it should come from, in my opinion, anyway.
Ken's going to give a quick response here.
Yeah, I think what you say is absolutely right. I mean, at the level of GPs, I think at one time, if you took, say, the 30s or 40s, GPs in Scotland and in Wales could tell co-workers pneumoconiosis or silicosis because they saw it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But to move on to, you said hand them on to, say, a consultant or an expert, it gets worse because occupational medicine's in crisis at the moment. Young people do not want to do occupational medicine. It's not sexy, they're not interested, they want to do molecular medicine or something far more modern. They look at the books on occupational medicine and they see things like silicosis and co-workers pneumoconiosis and they think, oh, I've never heard of that. Whereas all the modern approaches, molecular approaches to medicine is what they want to do. So it's going to get worse in the sense that even the people who are supposed to be the specialists won't have had a lot of first-hand experience of some of these diseases. And that goes across the board for asbestosis, mesothelioma, all these other diseases that are to do with inhaling dusts. So I think and what can you do about that? I mean, that's a really difficult one to address, isn't it? I mean, it needs a decision made high up in medicine in the UK and in the organisation of medicine that they create more jobs or positions for occupational physicians. I mean, that's a really difficult one.
Just to add on to that, because it's an interesting question. I've got one here. I found 2 or 3 cases in pneumoconiosis, and David was one of them, where they diagnosed sarcoidosis. Now, sarcoidosis, I checked, it's nodules on the lungs, but if you speak to the consultants, they will always say, well, on the balance of probability, because of their years' exposure to coal dust or silica dust, then there is a connection. But I mean, it gets more bizarre because there's a case that Myrette and myself are dealing with, and the boy from Walliford, he's got on his medical records that he was diagnosed with pneumoconiosis in 1981, and we submitted a claim to the Benefits Agency, and what they've said is they've turned it down and said he was wrongly diagnosed in 1981. And it was, well, how? I mean, he was diagnosed in the hospital with a consultant. How do they know that? Eh? Now that'll go to an appeal, but we've always took the view within the NUM when we deal with pneumoconiosis cases at appeal. Well, I always insist that there's a CISWO consultant on the panel, because sometimes that doesn't happen. And in fact, I mind there was one case that went to a commissioner. It was somebody who was a specialist in eyes, but he was sitting on in the panel trying to make a diagnosis on pneumoconiosis. So I find, especially in UK, Nicky, like say Dr. Sidlaw, he's done respiratory cases for years, and he's takes you, you've either got it or you've not got it, eh? And it's this wrongly diagnosed and sarcoidosis all round about it. In fact, David's now had word that he's never ever had sarcoidosis, but for years it kept put the place off. We had to get his consultant done a letter as evidence. The tribunal asked for it, that because of his years' exposure, that on the balance of probability that he would certainly have silicosis, and the sarcoidosis was another side effect. But now we can that he's not got sarcoidosis, so it's silicosis that he's got. So that's come up 2 or 3 cases. I think there's somebody else up in Gorbridge. Again, he told me, I met him at the Miners' Home, he said, my lungs are all scarred. Where did you work? He said, I work in the Lady Victoria. I said, well, if you work in the Lady Victoria, you've probably got pneumoconiosis or silicosis. Myrette went and seen him, put a claim in, but again, they're turned around and said he's got sarcoidosis. So it's a problem. No, it's not all that common, but it seems to be more, it's popping up more often lately. And I don't care if it's because younger doctors didn't ask them what their occupation was. Because if you just take somebody and say, oh, that could be sarcoidosis, what was your occupation? Where most of the CISWO consultants or the older CISWO consultants who dealt with mining areas, we could tell straight away. So there is a problem.
Ewan Gibbs, I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow. My research is about the closure of the mining and deep mining industry in Lanarkshire after the Second World War and the decline of deep mining. But in the oral history interviews that I've been doing, I've been struck by how often there's been references to not just disasters and the major events like the one that happened in Auchingeek in the late 50s and the incident at Cardigan that you've mentioned, but also the long-term development of disabilities and the experience that individuals had, and in particular that their families had with these disabilities, and perceptions of injustices that were suffered, particularly in the private industry actually, but even going onwards into the late 20th century. I was just wondering if oral testimonies had actually played any role in the struggles that you've mentioned around disabilities. Nicky mentioned the big court cases and the struggles involving hundreds of thousands of miners and claimants, and obviously Davey himself has went through an individual fight to get recognition for his disability. And I was also wondering if, with the focus towards PTSD and mental health impact, if that would change that and if there'd be more of a focus on using oral testimonies in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons the judge in the osteoarthritis of the knees claims he uses what's called the jurisdiction to say that, which is his opinion, that it would be very difficult to prove the working conditions that men were employed in, that caused osteoarthritis of the knees. And I found it very strange, and the fact that IAC, Industrial Injuries Advisory Council, recognised it as an industrial disease, or recommended it, and a government department accept that it is an industrial disease based on the evidence that went before a judge, yet another government department fought the case tooth and nail, and through a judge's jurisdiction we lost that. And for a judge to say that he could not, in his belief, they would not be able to get like management people to witness the facts, as if miners tell lies, you know, if they get into a dock and they're not going to tell the truth about their working conditions and all the rest of it, you know. That they couldn't get management type people to verify that. And I just think that beggared belief, and I think that's where oral stuff does play a lot, because there's management people who are suffering and have got claims for osteoarthritis of the knee just the same as miners, because they were in the same conditions, maybe not doing the same work, but because you're walking over rough ground, all the rest of it, getting jarred, hitting your head, all the rest of it. And I think oral is a big part to play, and that's what pleases me about things like this so much, from my point of view, on behalf of the union anyway, that if we don't record this, you know, we've got, it's part of our history, and the evidence is there, and people at the, you know, that go around speaking to the older people and taking them into schools, which I think is a brilliant thing. If we don't record that, a lot of these people are going to be gone soon. You know, I mean, the deep mining industry went away. Last one in Scotland was 2002, when Longannet flooded. So we're 12 years down the road now, and I think oral evidence is so important in cases like this, even because if that's there as evidence, then it can be used. There's precedents are there to say, well, we've got evidence to show these things happen. And that, as I say, I know I'm going back to it, but that was the perverse thing I found about that judge saying that, you know, that there weren't people there. Well, there was minors suffering from the disease that could relate to the working condition. So there's bound to have been people, in his view, management people who could verify all that, you know. So if that's the question, oral evidence, I think, is crucial in a lot of these things.
And when the CB&E cases were going on, they used oral evidence, didn't they? Mm-hmm. When families made claims for, you know, their father who's deceased, and the medical records obviously wouldn't be there because they'd already been destroyed. So quite often they were asked to contact workmates that their father had worked with, and to get him to verify the work that he did underground and exactly when he worked there, and you know what he did. So that was used, wasn't it?
Yep. Certainly also a key part of the asbestos-related diseases cases, particularly mesothelioma cases, where all evidence would be used to verify and locate a toxic product in a particular workplace. Miles, any other questions beyond Miles? Miles, I think
okay.
Maybe will be the last question.
Oh, God, really? I was just struck by the comment, the comparisons made with the oil and gas industry, and I was actually at Seafield Colliery the day after Piper Alpha went up with a health and safety officer, and it caused us to reflect a lot on what the coal industry and the miners themselves have given the culture of health and safety across people's working environments. And it struck me, just reminded me of a fantastic document that Ellie has in her collections at the National Mine Museum Scotland, which is a questionnaire which went out to all mine managers at the time of vesting in 1947, asking them about the facilities that they had. So this is before CISWO, definitely towards the end of the miners' welfare side of things. And it was just remarkable. I suspect there was an acceptance of the fact that there would be accidents and deaths. So quite a lot of pits had just an ambulance room or a first aid room, but some of them had, under their medical facilities, just nursing village. That was as much, or a morphia administration scheme. That was a level of, and so how far it's come with the work of the Welfare Fund and then CISWO afterwards, and the union in particular, and the health and safety advances. And so I suspect that there's a story to be told that's really positive about the industry, rather than just perhaps focusing on the more negative side of things. And I'd just like to finish with the observation that I got my training on asbestos from ex-miners through the Institute of Occupational Health, and they've left a really big mark and made, I think, a huge difference to the welfare of people and prevented quite a lot of harm that might have happened otherwise.
Yeah, but we've had some asbestos cases in the mining industry, you know, not to the scale of shipyards, things like that, But I mean, we've dealt, people that worked in the boiler houses and the surface, even underground, we've proven where there was brake linings involved and big haulage systems and all that, you know, that were asbestos lined, you know. So we've had some asbestos cases, but the thing I was going to say, that, you know, you talk about other industries, what people forget is that, in my view anyway, the National Coal Board was a training conduit for the whole of the British industry. Because when I started my time in 1967, 68, we started at one colliery, probably about 12 apprentices every year. And that went on throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. Now, when most of these guys served their time 4 years later, 5 years later, they left, but they went elsewhere. And that was always a hidden thing in my view, that people never realised how big a training thing for the whole of British industry the National Coal Board played. And if you look at the North Sea in the 70s and that, a lot of the guys, especially electricians, because they dealt with flame-proof equipment, all the rest of it, and the standards that they were trained to, went to the North Sea, you know. And I'm probably off on a tangent now about diseases, but that is how big an industry it was. And it played that role for, the training was done there for everybody else to pick up without cost, if you like, to them. So it's always interesting, that, I think.
Asbestos is also under the 1974 Coal Workers Pneumocuriosity Act. Asbestosis and mesothelioma is built into that. And Nicky's right, there's not a lot of asbestos cases, but we do deal with them if they pop up. And Nicky's right, the training at that time, health and safety was always a priority. And even before the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act, in the pits, we had what we call Section 123 of the Coal Mines and Quarries Act. We had workmen's inspectors who were paid for it. Men, I think it was a shilling off your wages or something, and they were paid to act on behalf of the workforce and carry out safety inspections in the colliery, and they were signed and countersigned. It always had to be two, and they were sent to government inspectors, and if the government inspectors weren't happy, they could cry out the pit and check it. But after the 1974 scheme had come, the Coal Board paid the wages. But certainly, it always had, we cried them 1, 2, 3 inspectors. Any accident, any reportable accident, then the representative who were elected through the union went out and investigated the accident. So there was certainly, and I think, Nicky, it was carried on under you, but always the NUM conference, the first debate at any conference was always on health and safety, and that always led the way all the time. So very, very conscious of health and safety. And I ken a lot of people say that there's too much health and safety. Well, there's no. There's no.
Okay, folks, we've had our panel on the go for almost 2 hours. I think it's time to draw things to a close. But I'd just ask the panel, any final comments or reflections you wish to make in response to any questions or points?
Just thanks for inviting us along. I think I've found it very interesting. I hope we've been helpful to you if it's possible.
I would concur with that. It's been very interesting. Makes a change for other debates.
Well, I've got to say, guys, this has been an absolutely wonderful experience hearing the testimonies, the views, the comments, the reflections, the personal stories and narratives from our panel. I really want to thank them really warmly for taking the time to come and share their stories with us. So many, many thanks, guys, for such a wonderful event, giving us a real insight into work and health culture and the lives of disabled people in these communities over the last probably 30 or 40 years. So thanks very much, guys. Many, many thanks. Could also thank you guys for contributing and coming along. Wouldn't have worked without you. Thank the technical crew. Many thanks, Craig, Ross, and particularly to thank Angela for all the hard work she's done in getting this thing organised and getting this witness seminar organised. So many thanks. Angie.